And we are back with another Daily Beacon Sports podcast production. This week, ahead of Tennessee football's matchup with Kentucky, we're talking with the Kentucky Kernel. Cole, why don't you just introduce yourself? And I appreciate you coming on today.
Yeah, of course. Happy to be here. My name is Cole Parke, and I'm the sports editor at the Kentucky Kernel, the independent student newspaper at the University of Kentucky. I've been sports editor for, I guess this will be coming up on 2 full years as editor and 2.5 years as an editor. I started as a assistant editor my freshman year, and we've been covering all kinds of sports since.
Yeah, I know we talked before about how football and basketball are kind of getting a little complicated now with the overlap. Just kind of put Kentucky's football season into perspective. What have they done good in your eyes? What have they done bad? And how have they kind of lived up to those expectations?
It's been it's really so far been a tale of two halves, and not necessarily a tale of two halves, a tale of the first, you know, five or so games, and then the last two. Um, a little bit it's kind of calmed down because of the bye week, but early on, Kentucky was a little bit disappointing. A lot of people were pretty disappointed in some of the offensive play, whatnot, but they were winning the games they needed to. And then they had the big game against Florida, who was ranked at the time, got a big win there, and Kentucky fans were, through the roof. You look at the schedule, how tough it was, and you think maybe they're a good team. You see really good resume building opportunities. You have Alabama and Georgia and Tennessee and all these other schools that, would be huge on a resume. And how sports fans can be. You start overreacting a little bit. You're like, we could go to Atlanta, we could go to the Natty, like, who knows? And then travel down to Athens to face Georgia. And that's when all optimism was quickly and strongly crushed in they gave up 50 plus, scored 13. It was brutal. The offense looked dead. The defense looked confused. And, a lot of people were quite upset. There was a lot of disappointment. Georgia's been kind of the monkey that Kentucky can't get off its back. They haven't beat them, I think, now in 14 straight tries. It's almost like Florida back in the day, except, just really disappointing. And then, but you still have people that were somewhat optimistic. Like, it's fine, Georgia's, your Alabama's, maybe even Tennessee, but still going to have a good season, host Missouri. And it's kind of been a storyline. We put out a piece on it on our website not too long ago, how Kentucky football has a problem of letting losses spiral. And they did that once again. And they blew a 14-0 lead. They were up 14-0 in the first quarter against Missouri, ended up losing 38-21. I believe they're outscored something like 17-0 one of the quarters, but it was a complete collapse on all fronts. The offense looked alive, and then you witnessed it die right in front of you. The defense was stopping things, and then suddenly it wasn't. And I think after that Missouri game, there was a lot of people very, very disappointed. You got your stereotypical Kentucky basketball. Well, it's basketball season now, whatever, So I think a lot of people are very frustrated, but I think all of that will pale in comparison to how much more disappointing it'll be if they come out and then lose to Tennessee again, because they've had a bye week now to kind of try to recalibrate. And, certainly I know there's a little bit of a discrepancy between some Tennessee and Kentucky fans where they believe it even is a rivalry or not, but Kentucky fans certainly do not like Tennessee, and losing to them for a third straight loss would be very demoralizing for Kentucky fans.
Yeah, and you talked about the tale of two halves, and Devin Leary was one of the top-rated quarterbacks out of the transfer portal. And you look around the SEC, and nobody really has a quarterback stealing the show, and Devin Leary was supposed to be that guy. It felt like he started out the season that way and then kind of fell off near the end in these recent losses. What have you seen from Devin Leary, and what does he have to be on Saturday for Kentucky to defeat Tennessee?
Yeah, I do agree with that point. When you look around the SEC, there's a lot of teams that are kind of struggling with quarterback issues. Alabama's quarterbacks aren't what Alabama quarterbacks usually are. Georgia's quarterback, not that Stetson Bennett was fantastic, but Carson Beck is still seen as a little bit of a step back. A lot of teams really struggle with quarterback play. Certainly, I'm sure a lot of Tennessee fans are missing Hendon Hooker right now. But I mean, I would say he started off still a little bit behind where people thought he was going to be, but he was able to get away with it a little bit better because the competition was, Eastern Kentucky University and Akron, and started SEC play with Vanderbilt. So despite them beating Kentucky last year, it was still, they haven't won an SEC game this year. So, it started off with easier competition. So he's able to kind of mask it a little bit. And people were willing to be a little bit more forgiving early on. As a transfer, he's had injuries in the past. He's kind of getting back into the swing of things, got to learn a new offense. He's going to be fine. And of course there were your people already week one saying like, oh, he's cooked, get him out of there. But, people were willing to give him some more slack, and people were willing to be more lenient with him and give him some time. But now, we're over halfway into the season, and he's still just been really, really disappointing to a lot of people. He has some relatively poor, reads. That was something you saw a lot with Will Levis. Sometimes too, people get mad with, but he'll throw it to a guy in double coverage, and it's even triple coverage sometimes. And you're just like, why are you making that throw? And certainly the Florida game gave Heupel some optimism, but certainly his offensive line hasn't been there a lot as well. There's been a lot of times he's been sacked quite a bit. And, all around, he certainly, when people saw offensive coordinator Liam Cohen coming back from the NFL, they saw what Levis was year one. They saw another transfer quarterback coming in with big ambitions. They saw Kentucky getting one of the biggest transfer quarterbacks in the portal. And there was a lot of really, really high expectations, perhaps even, unfair expectations placed upon him. But simply put, even most of the modest expectations he hasn't lived up to at this point. And he needs to have a good game in Tennessee for sure. I know Tennessee this year maybe not as good as last year's Tennessee team. That was a fantastic season for the Vols last year before it kind of, fell off the rails at the end. I know Hendon Hooker had an injury and whatnot, but it's still Tennessee football. And I think not enough people appreciate that really, because even the program that's had, some years that haven't been as good before, it's still a massive brand, and it's still an SEC squad that can beat, theoretically, maybe not Georgia or Alabama this year, but theoretically it could beat anybody else in the SEC, if you give them the opportunity. And I even say Alabama with a grain of salt, because they did do it last year. And I think that was a, close, if not equally leveled Alabama squad of this year. I think this Alabama team's starting to figure it out a little bit better after starting rough, but I think he needs to really be on top of his game. He needs to come out with that confidence. He needs to make the right reads, and this one's not necessarily his fault, but the wide receivers need to catch the ball. It's been a massive storyline this year, just the amount of drops there have been, and it's been really, really demoralizing to see. You had they ended up scoring anyway, but I want to say the Florida game saw Barryon Brown drop a touchdown in the end zone. He caught it in the end zone and just dropped it right there. And it's like, you can't have that. Florida might have let you get away with it, but even a somewhat stepped back Tennessee team is going to punish you for that. They're not going to give you another chance once you've got in the end zone like that. So, the offense as a whole needs to come out, and it can't just come out the way it did against Missouri, strong and then go away. It needs to come out and play for 4 quarters, not 1 quarter, not 2 quarters, 4 quarters, play a complete game of football. And, it's been a common thing. I said it after the Georgia game. It's in the SEC, you can't win a game when your opponent's beating you and you are beating yourself. It's just not possible. You have to stop shooting yourself in the foot if you want to win games. And Tennessee is not going to be an easy game.
You mentioned a lot there with the offense, but something I wanted to delve into a little bit more is that offensive line. When you think of like 2015, 16 maybe Kentucky teams all the way up to last year, the identity was that offensive line playing physical. Talk about, defensive guys playing in a phone booth, hat on hat inside the box. This year, it doesn't feel like that offensive line has lived up to the Kentucky standard that you've come to know with Mark Stoops and the Wildcats. What does that offensive line look like to you? And then Ray Davis as a running back, obviously leaned on a lot by the Wildcats. How has that offensive line maybe hampered him and could hurt him on Saturday?
Yeah, the offensive line's actually been a little bit cruel this year. I touched on the Florida game, but like you said, Kentucky kind of got a reputation, especially early on under Mark Stoops, as the big blue wall. It was notorious for being just really, really good pass rush protection and just fantastic. So going into last year, there'd been years it was kind of less strong than others, but last year is really where it first, I think, fell off a cliff because last year was abysmal. It was really, really bad. And it was a big storyline last year where Kentucky gave up a sack to Youngstown State. Like you can't be doing that respectfully as an SEC school. But no offense to Youngstown State. Love the Penguins, awesome mascot name. But um, so a lot of the talk about Big Blue Wall kind of went away after last year because of how bad it was. But it wasn't perfect start off, but then you had the Florida game, which was the first game in over a year where they hadn't given up a sack. No, not one single sack against Florida. So, I even we were talking about pieces, and there was even one I think I put out like, is the Big Blue Wall back? As a question people were posing, like they're getting excited. And then they traveled down to Georgia, and you learned, in fact, that the Big Blue Wall was not back. It was actually very far from back. And then Missouri showed the exact same thing. So, but what the cruelty that I was meaning there is that it gave fans a taste of what was, and then reminded you, oh, by the way, it is not anymore. And I don't know. I mean, they've kind of been moving people around. I know there's been a few injuries to that line, but it hasn't worked. They tried for a little bit to have Jagger Burton at center, and you had a couple high snaps. So they moved him back somewhere else, and they've had, we like to joke about it in my office, both Marcus and Eli Cox. So we call it Cox squared. Neither of them's really, I mean, Eli's been really solid. Marcus has been solid, but as a unit, it just seems like somebody on every other play is just not doing their role. And Ray Davis has been an absolute beast of a running back. He's been fantastic, so much so that even some of us, drank the Kool-Aid a little bit before the Georgia game, and we had a whole podcast segment asking if it could be Ray Davis for Heisman if they ended up upsetting Georgia and Alabama. And like if they did do that, and he's the running back to let him do that, it's possible because he had a career game against Florida. Came close to breaking the school record for single season, or not single game rushing. But I think he kind of helped masquerade that performance was pretty mediocre as well from the O-line, and not the O-line as much as and the receivers and quarterback. But yeah, I mean, he's a very humble guy. He's always going to credit his offensive line for making holes and giving him lanes to run. But I think that certainly there's a few times where he's been, somewhat screwed over by poor blocking that has kind of led to him taking contact earlier. And, he's a guy, Kentucky's kind of had a lot of these guys in the past few years. Benny Snell is a guy who did this too, but he'll continue to get yards after contact. But the goal as a running back still should be to take as little contact as possible, because it's harder. Every yard after contact is harder than a yard without contact. So certainly he's still been killing it, and he's still been having strong showings for the most part. I mean, sometimes it feels like it's the Ray Davis show on offense because there's not a whole lot else to look forward to. But, I think that while he's been able to relatively make the most of a poor situation, that the offensive line has still hampered him because, ideally, if you had great blocking, he'd be able to do even more. And, the thought of what could have been, I'm sure that's one that'll linger in Kentucky's fans for a while.
Yeah, I feel like we've talked enough about the offense now, which seems like it'll probably turn into a Tennessee's first and second level versus Ray Davis the whole night, like a lot of Tennessee games have turned into this season, surprisingly. Moving towards Kentucky on the defensive side of the ball, what do the Wildcats show? Where have they been good? Where have they maybe struggled?
So that's an interesting one, because that one has been more so a tale of two seasons than the offense has. The offense kind of struggled a little bit throughout the year, but the defense started off, I think, really, really solid. A lot of Kentucky fans are very, very high on defensive coordinator Brad White and all he's done there. And, you highlight so many performances that have happened in the last few years of Kentucky just staying in games defensively and having a bend but don't break defense, as they like to call it. And they looked very, very good against Florida. But, going into the Georgia game, maybe fans were a little bit too optimistic because it was still Georgia. Georgia had been a little bit shaky up to that point. But last year in Kroger Field, it was kind of poor weather conditions, a little bit rough. And they were able to hold the eventual national champions to 16 points. So there was a lot of optimism going into that game about like, hey, could we stop Georgia? Could we really, do this? But 50 plus is speaks for itself. That's not hey, a few plays went wrong. That's across the board. We were bad. And yeah, I mean, another storyline with the defense as well has been some of the poor penalties. I mean, Kentucky as a whole has been getting a lot of really, really bad flags lately. And I'm not like saying ref bad flags. I'm saying like stupid player flags, like personal fouls and unnecessary roughness and whatnot. And the defense has been leading the way on some of that. There was one player I remember that sticks out to me against Georgia. They actually managed to, tackle Georgia for no gain on a rush. And then for some reason, after stopping the play, one of the linemen decided, I'm going to shove him back down when he goes to get up. And that was a 15-yard penalty, automatic first down. So can't do that, first of all. But, you saw it against Missouri as well. Maybe not as many unnecessary roughness. There was one I remember as well where the defense made a stop and the receiver was being a little bit snarky and he flipped the ball up at Kentucky's defensive player, who then caught it and decided, oh, I'm going to throw this right back at him while he's still on the ground. And you know how football goes. The person who retaliates is always going to be the one who gets punished. And he did get punished for that. And, even beyond that, there's been, pass interference. There's a couple of those in that game. And it seems like the defense started off so strong, but has lately just either not been locking them down the way they used to, or whenever they do lock them down, it seems like you're always like, all right, well, is there going to be a flag coming in? Because this is ridiculous. But I think there's been a lot of really, really good play on the defense, despite some of the penalties. There's a lot of really, people like to say dogs. There's a lot of dogs on the defense, which is ironic since Kentucky's the Cats. But, Trevin Wallace coming back is going to be a big one. He was out last week, and Devin Leary did great in his absence, but Trevin is a big piece of this defense. Zion Childress is always a stud. Deion Walker's a great player. You got Octavius Oxendine on the defensive line. There's a lot of really big names on this defense who I trust to make a play, and hopefully can go back to trusting not to get a flag after making the play. But another one too. He's been a little bit shaky sometimes on pass coverage. I know he gave up a couple 20-plus yard plays against Georgia, but Maxwell Hairston is 2 interceptions away from breaking the single-season interception record at Kentucky. I believe he's got 5 picks so far this year, including 2 pick sixes against Vanderbilt. He was the first player in UK history to score 2 pick sixes in one game. So he's been having himself a career season, and one of those types of seasons where it doesn't matter how many times he gets burned, he can get drafted on his numbers alone. And that's been really impressive to see. So, the defense as a whole has a lot of the pieces, and it seemed like they were putting it together early. The question now is whether or not, they got rattled, they got punched in the mouth. Can they kind of put it back together and go back to being the Kentucky defense people expect them to be?
So now that we've covered the good and the bad on both the offensive and defensive sides, what are your keys to victory for Kentucky on Saturday? What will the Wildcats have to do to pull off a victory? And then what would your score prediction be?
Oof. I would say on offense, they need to be sound for the entire game. You got to play all 4 quarters. You got to not make the bad reads. You got to not drop the ball. Ray Davis is going to do his thing. On defense, you got to put it back together and stop shooting yourself in the foot with penalties. If you can clean up the penalties and go back to playing as a unit, the defense will be strong. And the offense, you just got to trust them to do their part. So, it sounds pretty easy on paper to say that play better is the thing we need to do, but that's a lot of it. Just put it together and play the way, bits and pieces. Every part of this team has shown potential at some point. You just need to put that all together at the same time, not, let it be, oh, this group played good today. No, all of you need to play good at the same time. And theoretically, that sounds easier on paper, but that's what every good football team has to do. So simple as that, not having one individual good performance, having a team good individual performance. And my score, well, I'll be honest with you, a lot of Kentucky fans won't like this, but even before the season started, I predicted 3 losses for Kentucky, and Tennessee was one of them. So I'm not flipping on that. I think the Vols are going to win. and it doesn't matter the home field to me. I saw 2 years ago when it was a 45-42 shootout and Tennessee won off a field goal they got right before the half. So I think the Vols are going to win this one. I think I'm going to predict 28 to 20.
Interesting. I feel like everybody in our office also predicted Tennessee to pull away with a win as well. Cole, I appreciate it again. Why don't you just plug everything y'all are doing with the Kernel and where people can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you having me on here. So we have our website at kykernel.com. We also have a few special sections on the racks on campus, but my Twitter is Cole Parke _WSC, and our Twitter is KY Kernel Sports. We do sports coverage of every sport on UK Athletics, but with basketball and football going on, that's the bulk of our coverage right now. And we're looking forward to doing some really, really cool things with basketball season and finishing out football season strong. So a lot of really cool things coming down the pipeline that I'm excited to be able to share with the world. So KY Kernel Sports on Twitter and kykernel.com is where you can find us, not KentuckyKernel.com, because unfortunately there's also a flour company called Kentucky Kernel that got there first. But kykernel.com, that's where we're at, and that's where you can find me.
Awesome. Cole, I appreciate it again. For Cole Parke, I'm Caleb Jarrow, and this is another production of the Daily Beacon Sports Podcast Network.